Thank you, Professor Tao。多謝涂黎寶華教授。我哋有請新力量網絡主席呂大樂教授致歡迎詞，有請呂大樂教授。
I really have to do it very, very briefly. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today for this policy forum. As put by Julia, this is the fourth round of our policy discussions. As usual, we emphasize on 2 points. One is being interactive, meaning that today we have all these distinguished speakers coming from various fields of specialization. We do hope that we would have that kind of exchange between government and the general public, among scholars as well as people from all walks of life. We also hope that we will be interactive in the sense that in the later part of our discussion, we would have really free exchanges among all members here today. The other point we would like to emphasize is on the need of being grounded. Grounded meaning that we invited experts and leading scholars, especially, and also opinion leaders, coming here to have grounded discussions. In other words, we are not just expressing opinions and also our stance, but also hoping that we would address key issues, not just right now, but also for the future, and how to relate that to policy makings. So, as promised, I'll really make it brief. And so, once again, thank you very much. Thank you.
多謝呂大樂教授。好，事不宜遲啦，我哋立即開始我哋研討會嘅第一部分國際經驗分享。有請涂黎寶華教授為我哋主持及介紹嘉賓。
First of all, I would like to thank actually Mr. Kenneth Chan, the Undersecretary for Education, for his presence with us today. We are really honored to have him as a government senior official who will be providing a response to the discussion today. This is a very good tradition, and we really want to thank the government because for each of our public forum debates, whatever, we always have a very senior government officials who come to share with us their honest reactions and response. Previously, we have Dr. Yok Chow and also Mr. Matthew Cheung to talk about labor issues, welfare, and also healthcare. And today with Mr. Kenneth Chan, we are very grateful for your presence. Now, then, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker today. We're again very honored to have a very distinguished and experienced speaker in the field of international education. And he's the Minister Counselor Education from Australian Embassy, China. He is Mr. Iain WATT, and Mr. WATT is currently posted to Beijing as Minister Counselor for Education. Mr. Iain was Director International Development and Cooperation at the Australian National University between 2004 to 2007. He had wide experience in this field of international education and has managed many branches within the International Education Group of the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations in Australia. And he has contributed importantly to Australia's international education policy development since 1992. So let's give Mr. Watt a big hand and invite him to share us with his thoughts.
Thank you very much. If it's okay with everyone, I'll just stay seated here to speak. First of all, I'd like to thank City University and SynergyNet and everyone else involved with this event for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak to you all. I thought the easiest way to do this would be just to start off with a little bit of a history of how Australia got to where we are now as a provider of services to international students and the other elements that go with international education, and to emphasise that we didn't get it right to start with. We made mistakes in the way in the sort of policy settings we put in place. Everybody will make mistakes, and Hong Kong shouldn't think you're going to get it right first time off. But you can learn from the mistakes that we have made and get it closer. But what you need to do changes as society develops. So the Australian government made the decision to start promoting Australia as a destination for private fee-paying international students in the late 1980s. So before 1987, all the international students in Australia were in Australia on some form of scholarship or subsidy. In 1987, the government made the decision that from then on, our universities and other institutions would be allowed to recruit international students on a fee-paying basis. And one of the prerequisites which you might want to be careful to note was that they had to pay at least the full cost of their education programs. So universities were not allowed to recruit students unless the students were paying at least the full cost. In other words, it wasn't allowed to become a situation where the Australian taxpayers were subsidising the education of these students. That was a policy position. Of course, no one envisaged that 20 years later, international students in Australia would number over 500,000, nor that the industry, as it now is, would in a single year bring in more than 15 billion Australian dollars worth of export earnings to Australia. But it was established as a commercial activity with a view to allowing our universities and other providers to supplement their sources of income, and the government was at that stage very conscious of the over-reliance of our universities on government as a source of funding. If you think back to that time, it wasn't a very popular view. The idea that education was something that could be bought or traded, could be treated to some extent as a commodity, was argued very strongly against, especially by those countries in continental Europe. And over the last 20 years, it seems that most of these countries have come closer to Australia's way of thinking about international education. And even the European countries now recognise that the level you set, you can't forever allow your students to study at no cost. And the fee levels that you set do influence the student choices and behaviour. So how did Australia go about setting itself up as a hub? Well, for the first 6 or 7 years, up until 1994, the Australian government had no agency which had any real responsibility for international education. The government really took a while to recognise that it had a role to play here. And it really took the mess that we created in mainland China in 1989 and 1990, where we ended up with thousands of students who had paid for courses at private education institutions which really hardly even existed and were really set up on a fairly fraudulent basis. It ended up costing the Commonwealth Government $70 million Australian back 20 years ago to repay funds to those students who'd been defrauded in that period. And of course that brought home to the Australian government the need for the government to be much more involved. Initially we set up a network of Australian education centres around Asia, and we authorised IDP, which was a company owned by the 38 Australian universities at the time, to manage these centres. What happened, of course, was that didn't work very well because IDP used these centres. IDP is really a company, and it used these companies to give itself an aura of being a government agency. And to give itself a market advantage over other agencies that were interested in the placement of students. So in essence, it was operating its own interests, which often were counter to those of the government and counter to those of the universities it was supposed to be representing. It also undermined our efforts as a government to establish the necessary government-to-government relationships and frameworks. So in 1993, in response to this and also in response to what had happened in China, the government, the department wrote a cabinet submission, of which I was a member of the team that wrote the submission, to establish an organisation which ended up being called the Australian International Education Foundation.